Welcome back to the Metal Maniacs Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Ingersoll, and I'm here with my co-host,
Mod.
So today we are going to go into part 2 of the godfather of death metal, Chuck Schuldiner.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So anybody who's just picking up from the last episode, I'll do a quick rundown from the first part of the biography, and then we'll dive into all of the new content. So to recap, just so you guys, if it's been a few weeks since you heard the first part 1 of Evil Chuck, Chuck, by his own admission in several interviews over the years, was a laid-back family guy who liked to spend time at home. While in the beginning, he was an unstoppable bullet train with death, rolling out of the gates, cranking out 3 albums in 3 years. The dark side of the music business, combined with a lack of healthy work-life balance, started to take its toll. Things came to a head during the spiritual healing era as then band members Terry Butler and Bill Andrews decided to hire roadies Walter Traxler and Louis Carrizales to perform guitar and vocal duties in order to legally tour Europe, supporting Creator while using the Death moniker without Schuldiner, as he cited the tour wasn't set up very well and that he needed to spend some time at home to deal with some personal matters. After the European tour without him concluded, Chuck won legal control of the Death name, and he fired Terry Butler and Bill Andrews and decided to go forward with session members, a decision which would once again alter the future of metal. Sound the way you remember it, Jay?
Yeah,
all right.
Sounds exactly what we talked about in the first episode.
All right, so there is the recap. Death, 3 albums, 3 years. He's only 23 years old at this point.
Okay.
The band falls apart in Europe, and he has to put it back together. So we'll pick up here at Chapter 2, the second half of Chuck's career, as I like to title it, The Godfather of Death Metal. The evolution of death really started to take off around this time of the Human album. Everything changes by the time we arrive at this landmark album. While the lineup of Death rotated with each album and subsequent touring cycle, it was at the time of Human that Chuck began working with an entirely higher caliber level of musicians. Upon recruiting Paul Masvidal and Sean Reinert of Cynic to play guitar and drums respectively, and calling on a friend in Steve DiGiorgio, bassist of Sadus, the lineup of Human was born. It was like...
That was the church bell at the end.
sounded prophetic. The sanguine union of these musicians resulted in producing not only another monumental album for extreme metal music, but it also served to help push the genre forward once again, this time changing the landscape of metal largely in part to the style of the performers on the recording. There was a drastic leap forward in musicianship on all instruments once we arrive at Human. The jazz inspiration from Cynic members, combined with the fearless and fretless tenacity of Steve DiGiorgio's bass playing, helped to see the band transition out of the brutal death metal cycle which Death was known for, and into a much more technical and progressive direction. The growth and transformation of Death was also reflected in the lyrical content, shifting further into philosophical and existential realms, while further distancing themselves from themes of gore and fantasy, even transcending topics of social commentary. The art direction also changed at this time, moving away from the comic book style drawings offered by artist and illustrator Ed Repka, and onto the paintings of Rene Mivilli. The new art direction evokes several deeper feelings ranging from spiritual and esoteric to introspective and self-reflective, coinciding with the lyrical and musical growth that is also displayed on the album. All things were changing in the world of Death and Chuck Schuldiner, and in an ever-changing world, they grew and adapted with the times. Human not only delivered an unrelenting and punishingly heavy musical effort by Death, but it also boasted their first musical video. Lack of comprehension helped to turn the heads of fans looking to expand the horizon of their listening experience. Video exposure provided by Headbangers Ball on MTV helped to push Death and death metal into a larger audience. With the album captivating fans and audiences anew, Death toured and saw excitement and demand for their art grow. Europe wanted Death to come back and make up for the debacle from the last album's tour cycle. During promotional interviews for the album, Chuck and the current members promised to make it up to the fans, but the wheels came off about halfway through this European tour. With members getting sick and finances drying up, the tour imploded and the members went home without their gear before the tour was complete. It was a sad end to a triumphant album and a defiant comeback from the last European tour cycle. While the struggles of completing a European tour hounded Chuck and Death, it did not discourage him from bouncing back and continuing to put out his brand of metal. Chuck's persistent attitude and relentless drive to pursue his vision led to the next evolution of Death with individual thought patterns. Though Chuck seemed to be at a place of peace and enlightenment during the human era, time tells the tale of anger, bitterness, and an expression of karma wished upon others during the individual thought patterns era. This album reflects a slight return to an aggressive feeling both musically and lyrically as Chuck addresses both his negative experiences in the music business and the amount of negative press directed at him. This led to a falling out with band manager Eric Greif and him being fired. They had some legal matters which they ultimately resolved, and Eric was rehired sometime later, but the anger and frustration resulting from the events and relationship between the two at this time are reflected in the lyrical content. Once again, the lyrics were being pushed in a new direction, giving the listener a very open-ended interpretation of the ideas presented to them. In order to bring this darker vision to life, Death had to again recruit new blood to execute a more vicious plan of attack. Gene Hoglan of Dark Angel came on to assume the throne behind the drum kit, and S-tier lead guitarist Andy LaRocque of King Diamond fame was introduced into the fold to add some spice to the melody section. Steve DiGiorgio marked his return to the band with another world-class bass clinic on individual thought patterns. His performance is also highlighted by an undoubtedly better mix compared to his work on the previous album, Human. The bass work on individual thought patterns to this day serves as a textbook guide on how to play bass in an extreme metal band. The drumming is as intense as ever for a death album, somehow managing to both capture an essence of the brutal death metal era of old and yet display the necessary articulation, touch required to match the musicianship up front. Gene's drumming shows off plenty of bells and whistles reminiscent of the work of Sean Reinert's drumming on Human, only faster. Andy LaRocque was the cherry on top of this album, offering blistering leads that easily stay with the listener after just one listen. By virtue of the choice in guitar harmonies on the leads, or the touch of reverb or flange or chorus effect, each solo demands the listener's attention. Some melodies are repeated just enough to have a lasting effect on listeners. They are unlike any before or after this album, and for that, Individual Thought Patterns is an all-time gem of a metal album on the merits of the lead guitar work alone.
Yeah, it kind of felt like during Individual, this is, Human, they were starting to get more technical, but then all of a sudden here comes Individual, and then you got Andy LaRocque playing these harmonized leads, doing this tapping stuff with Chuck trying to up his game, and then Gene comes in with just that machine gun tight drumming, which I also felt like made Gene a better drummer at that. It's just like a wild mix of musicians to really put the stamp on Individual Thought Patterns.
For me, it's mind-blowing that they would go from the level of musicianship at Human, and you think, okay, that's, you can't get any better than that, and then here they come with Individual Thought Patterns, and no, they actually probably did one up the musicianship of Human. So yeah, and that was the theme for Death and Chuck's career the whole way. Now, not only was Individual Thought Patterns sweet vindication for Chuck musically and personally, but Death also achieved success in their subsequent tour of Europe, finally completing all of the dates which they were slotted to perform. As told by Steve DiGiorgio in Death by Metal, he and Gene Hoglan really rallied behind Chuck in order to see the tour through to the finish. Death continued to ride the wave of success in the form of another music video, this time for the album's closing track, The Philosopher. It not only garnered more airplay on Headbangers Ball, but it also helped to inject a massive surge in popularity into the band, as they were also featured on MTV's hit show Beavis and Butthead. While Death was growing its fan base, Chuck was also branching out even further in his musical stylings, and Death would yet again evolve in accordance with his vision and move further away from their initial sound and into an even more melodic realm. For the vision he had his sights set on, this next departure would be symbolic of all future endeavors from Death and Chuck Schuldiner offerings.
It's almost like some of these death metal bands and darker extreme bands at least got their due on Beavis and Butthead, you know, like they got their like Beavis and Butthead treatment, so like you were exposed to it whether you wanted to be or not, you know.
It's definitely how I learned a few of these things. I think maybe even Carcass, I'm not for sure, or I remember seeing them on there though nonetheless.
Napalm Death, Morbid Angel, I remember all that stuff. They were fucking
ripping on it.
Yeah, ripping on it. It's funny.
If anything in this world is consistent, it is the inevitability of change. And so, another Death album would invariably introduce new players to create what can only be considered as a world-class, all-time greatest metal album in the form of the masterpiece titled Symbolic. Gene Hoglan marks his return to the band, while new additions Bobby Colby and Kelly Conlon round out the lineup on lead guitar and bass respectively. The vocals even see a drastic development in clarity, with a focus on enunciation and a tonal direction that leans into the melodic control of Chuck's Fry vocal style. As described by Gene Hoglan, the music on the album really reflected Chuck's love of power metal and felt to him as though it was the beginning of a drastic departure from the faster, heavier, more aggressive style of individual thought patterns. Symbolic flexed heaviness from start to finish, but it did its best to shine as an album by giving songs a lot of room to breathe melodically. At the mere age of 27 years young, Chuck Schuldiner sculpted one of the most melodic death metal albums of all time, something that ages better and better as the years pass us by, an album that still begs to be challenged by any other contender of the genre. Not only that, but it stands as its own as a piece of art that can be enjoyed by nearly any person with an open mind about music.
I do think Symbolic was a little less technical, if that's fair to say, than almost like Individual and even Human, just with all the fretless bass going on the other two albums, and then like the crazy guitar leads, where I feel like this was a little more reined in on songwriting, clarity, production. All that was a little more, you know, a little more unified, where the other albums kind of branched out into this more jazzy progressive type of feel. This one kind of came back home to like the raw death metal stylings of like actual like songwriting and not going too far off in tangents musically, where I felt the other two previously kind of did that.
I feel like with Symbolic, they harken back to Human with the groove. I think the tempo dropped a little bit, but there is less technicality and more musician, but yet more melody and musicianship in it.
Yeah, for sure.
So
I think that just comes with growth too, just like we always talk about, like just kind of like you try different things as you progress or whatever, but like kind of reining that back in and then just focusing more on the songwriting, the lyrics, and what the song is about. Like, I think that's why Symbolic stands out so much, you know, to me at least.
Yeah, and I don't think he was playing up against a skilled ceiling where he was like content with what he could do on the guitar, and he didn't feel the need to play up against his skill ceiling, and he was more focused on songwriting.
Yeah, for sure.
While Symbolic is a masterpiece enjoyed by fans old and new, Chuck was keen to distance himself from the term death metal, somewhat lamented the band name, explaining that he would probably choose something different at that point in time, and he didn't want to be billed or promoted alongside other death metal bands by the record label. This sentiment was carried out further after the touring cycle for Symbolic ended, and Chuck essentially dissolved Death. Symbolic was the springboard for Chuck to move on from death metal and steer his vision into an even more melodic direction by seeking to abandon the Fry vocal approach in favor of a clean power metal vocalist like Bruce Dickinson of Iron Maiden, Rob Halford of Judas Priest, or early Warrell Dane a la Sanctuary. When Chuck moved on from Roadrunner Records, the intention was to move on from Death and start a new project on Nuclear Blast Records. By all accounts, The Sound of Perseverance is Death's swan song, and beyond that, it is an introduction to the final era of Chuck's musical offerings. With the move to Nuclear Blast Records, the lineup was built again from scratch as Chuck sought members that he felt would help usher in the first chapter of a new musical chapter in his life. Shannon Hamm took over lead guitar duties for the new album and tour, while Richard Christie, now of Howard Stern fame, handled the drum duties and Scott Clendenin laid down the bass. However, before the label was willing to go all in on Chuck's vision, they asked him to produce one last Death album before rebranding with a new vocalist. As Shannon Hamm tells in Death by Metal documentary, several of the songs were intended to be control-denied songs. Demo versions of songs from The Sound of Perseverance exist, with Chuck displaying himself as a power metal vocalist. And the album itself showcases his vocal range with a legendary cover of Painkiller by Judas Priest. Chuck's vocal demos were used to search out the vocalist for the ensuing Control Denied project. The Sound of Perseverance era was a glorious and triumphant time for Chuck and Death. The group performed at Dynamo Open Air Festival in Eindhoven, Netherlands, and completed another successful tour of the world. Chuck had the lineup that he wanted, and he sent Death out on a high note. Destiny was back in Chuck's hands.
Yeah, Sound of Perseverance, I remember hearing that, and like, it's hard to say because all of a sudden I felt like it was like a mix of now symbolic and almost the individual thought patterns and human all together, because there are like some weird, melodic musical, snippets on there. They kind of go off on these tangents. Although the bass player was not Steve DiGiorgio, there was these really wicked bass lines on there that really stuck out. I mean, they were in the pocket, but they were tight. So it was like a mix of the songwriting and then just like even more of an expression of melodicism and like just technicality that was like not what it was on Human. It's really hard to explain the jump from the jump from symbolic to The Sound of Perseverance. It fits the catalog, but at the same time, it does seem like it's completely different.
It makes sense that it's intended to be control-denied music.
Yeah.
It feels like when you're listening to it, if anything, it sounds like it's got some elements of symbolic to it, but you could tell, like, Chuck was leaning into the melody. The lead guitar playing took center stage as the focus of the songwriting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like there would just be some chords behind what he was doing and just a lot of guitar work. And he was really pushing away from like the death metal sound. So Sound of Perseverance was, you could tell, like intended to be the last death album.
Well, what's weird about that though too is like when you listen to the Control Denied Fragile Art of Existence, like to me, I think there's leaps and bounds. Like there are parallels, but I think the Sound of Perseverance and then the Control Denied album, I think there's a massive gap between those two, because it goes even further off. I mean, obviously the musicians are different, but yeah, those albums are kind of removed from each other as well,
Like Symbolic and Sound of Perseverance may have power metal influence, but when you listen to Control Denied, he's way further down that path.
Mm-hmm.
But it's almost its own thing now. It doesn't feel too much like power metal. It feels like post-power metal.
Yeah. Like a technical power metal or something like that,
Yeah.
really progressive,
So speaking of Control Denied, after Death concluded their world tour in 1998, vocalist Tim Amar was added to the new lineup along with Steve DiGiorgio returning to the fold to help form Chuck's lifelong passion project, Control Denied. During the recording of The Fragile Art of Existence, Chuck began to experience unrelenting neck pains and was advised to get an MRI. In 1999, it was discovered that Chuck had brain cancer. Unable to afford the surgery which he immediately needed, a number of famous musicians rallied behind Chuck in an effort to help pay for the medical expenses incurred. While Chuck was fighting for his life in New York, the band finished recording the album at Morrisound Studios in Florida. The album was released May 13th, 1999. The band held out hope for an opportunity to open for Metallica on the Gods of Rock tour, but had to back out at the last minute as Chuck's condition worsened. Though he was too ill to perform, Chuck continued to write and record as much as he could. He wrote and recorded a second Control Denied album, When Man and Machine Collide, with Richard Christie recording all of the drums in a single day. Time, however, was not on Chuck's side, and experimental treatments were now being used as a last resort to save Chuck's life. Fate, however, is not without its cruel sense of irony, for as he gained control of his artistic vision, his very life would be denied. And on December 13th, 2001, surrounded by the family he so dearly loved, Chuck Schuldiner died at the age of 34 years young. Forever let the metal flow, Chuck Schuldiner.
Yeah, it's crazy that someone we held in such high regard, leaves so early. It's the same way as like the Dimebag thing for like Pantera fans. It's just life doesn't stop at nothing, man. But for him to make such an impact has literally been inspiring and a huge impact to us, at least. Like maybe somebody doesn't even know who Chuck is, and then learning about your heroes and his times and his tribulations with touring and going back home, and you get a different look into Chuck, because to us we held him on such a pedestal where it's like, but he was also human too, so like you let the art speak for itself as well, so
it's bittersweet. He definitely has a long legacy, just musically speaking. But I think, with the documentary and the interviews, the proof is in the pudding too, in terms of what kind of person Chuck was. And I'm happy to know that, all the while I was, worshiping this guy's music and just indulging in the lyrical content and everything, that behind it all, there was this really sincere, genuine person, just a good person that, people didn't really have anything bad to say. Maybe he was hard to work with, or what have you, but, just a laid back, down to earth kind of a guy. He expressed that sentiment. That sentiment was reinforced by others in the documentary, family and friends. And, at 34 years old or young, like my life hadn't really begun in ways, right? Like, so for me, just personally, anecdotally, like 34 years, I don't have a child yet. So like, just imagine one day you're just a person, and then the next day you're responsible for a whole other person.
Yeah.
So when I look back at the age and the number of 34, like this guy, he was robbed of an entire life that he could have had, from there forward. Things start going well for him. The musicians in the group, Control Denied, picks up. He's about to open for Metallica. You never know what kind of life this guy has if he beats the illness.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I was thinking too. Like, think about myself at 34, like maybe he didn't get along with some of the other band members, and it was hard for them to work with, and, so many reiterations of death throughout the years or whatever. But it's like, look at us and look at the bands we were in and the different amalgamations of people and people we've jammed with that just didn't work. And that was just here. He was on a different stage having some high caliber musicians. Some of them also had other projects. So it's like, as the albums progressed, he just didn't have the four guys that lived in his area. He's working with Andy LaRocque, that's already with King Diamond. You know what I mean? There's a whole career there. Gene Hoglan with Dark Angel, on to Testament, whatever. You know what I mean? Steve DiGiorgio, Sadist has always kind of been his thing. Then he went on to Testament as well. So it's like he's working with these musicians, but I feel at the same time, those weren't musicians that were like people that would probably always just stay with death. You know what I mean? Right. So it's like, just to think of where you were at 34, you still don't really have shit figured out. Not that you really ever will or do, because you're always figuring it out. You're always progressing. But yeah, it is kind of wild to think about what more of an impact could he have had. Could he went on and been our days avenged sevenfold? You don't know. You have no idea. But I'm glad that he left behind what he did at that, and to say what he accomplished by 34 years, like, a lot more than a lot of people have, and his impact on music and extreme music throughout the world. So,
and I know he didn't do it alone. There was help from, family and friends, but it feels like in a way he was on his own. He was death. He did all of the music, and he had all these helping hands to make it, but he held it together. he could have said, no, I'm not doing this anymore. This is too much of a hassle. I've been burnt too many times. I'm just a regular guy. I don't need to like really pursue this and put up with this anymore. So I think he accomplished a lot in 34 years, and his legacy still deserves to be, looked at and analyzed and propagated going forward. I think people need to know about Chuck Schuldiner as both a person, like the man behind the art, to understand the art itself going forward. And I want to keep the music of death relevant, especially the latter work, From Human Forward, the second part of the bio here. That is some of the best music in my personal experience that I've ever listened to. Very meaningful to me, and highly recommend.
I mean, there's a lot of people, though, too. I mean, among the extreme metal community, the different Facebook pages and stuff, and they feel the same way about Chuck and his music and the impact. So, I mean, it's still out there. There's still new young metal listeners coming up listening to this stuff. So it's just one of those things where it's like it is a staple in extreme music, and I'm glad it is that way because of the profound impact that it has had on us. The albums, and still sticking out, still listening to it, still just clamoring for anything death that we could. Of course, we would selfishly want more. But at the same time, we have enough to suffice at this particular moment in time.
We have to accept what we have. I mean, there is a little bit more here. I will read just a bit more about the last efforts that Chuck had been working on. So, Life After Death. Sadly, Chuck's parts for When Man and Machine Collide could not be recovered from his personal recording device, despite efforts by Richard Christie to use his resources at SiriusXM to recover those files. Chuck had said to longtime friend and producer Jim Morris that if it can't be done right, don't do it. In the years following Chuck's passing, both Eric Greif and Steve DiGiorgio would go on record saying that all attempts to salvage Chuck's personal recordings had ended and that there would never be a finished second Control Denied album. A demo of 4 songs totaling over 30 minutes of music exists on YouTube, and several iterations of a formal death tribute band have toured over the years, going by the monikers Death to All and Death DTA. The lineup tends to feature various historical members of Death performing their respective era of Death material in honor of Chuck Schuldiner and his legacy. I also want to note that earlier this year, Tim Amar did pass away. So even if by some miracle there was a chance to recover any of those demos and put them to Richard Christie's drum tracks, we now have lost Tim Amar as well. So there really is no chance of a second Control Deny album. But I did listen to the demo. I don't know how the family or anybody would feel about that. I know Chuck didn't want it out there if it wasn't right. For me, it did sound like instrumental Chuck Schuldiner, like just riffing away on the guitar. It sounded exactly like what I would expect it to sound like, and it was good. I don't want to sit here and promote it and say, go run out there and listen to it if the family doesn't want you to listen to it. I just tripped over it in the same interview as the Steve DiGiorgio interview talking about it, so I let it roll in the background as I was typing things up. But there's not going to be anything more but for us to continue his legacy and to tell people you really should take a minute and listen to some Death albums. It'll improve your ear for music, and it'll steer you on a path of songwriting and understanding of melody that will only help you, I feel like. And as an average, that's just for musicians. As an average music fan, I think, Death is good music to listen to no matter what you're doing.
Yeah, and kind of like we talked about in other episodes, like the name could almost be off-putting because someone could almost hear it, and it's like, well, if you don't listen to the first basically 2 albums, then after that, like the name doesn't really almost kind of match what's going on in the music. Like, yeah, he kind of locked that name down first and left his mark amongst death metal, but at the end of the day, like it's come so far from actually sounding like death almost, it's just like something that was there, and like you said, he thought he would change the name. And I also know that there was talk of Warrell Dane, R.I.P., being part of the the Control Denied album, he would have been the vocalist and everything, and that would have been sweet as fuck. I mean, Tim did a great job, but just having World Dane on it, that would have been something that would have been unbelievable. But something happened there, and it didn't line up. But I do remember hearing that rumor or of thoughts of that along the way.
That would have been something. Man, I'd like the Control Denied album, and I'm down with Tim's vocals on that album, but to think that we could have had World Dane on that, who, we're also missing, and that collaboration now takes place in another timeline, in another life.
Yeah.
But, we won't be receiving that, but that would have been something special. We'll be talking about World Dane and Nevermore, on this podcast, eventually, sooner than later, I'm sure. But that's pretty much what I've got, for Chuck and his bio and his life. I took some time away from listening to Death for a while. I kind of we all just Chuck himself moved forward, right? But at the time of his passing, I remember being like, that's a major bummer that I can't believe. I didn't know how to process that. And I kind of had to go back and I listen to all of this stuff now some years later. And some of it just takes me right back to Clifford, the big red truck, and,
Clifford.
And also whatever blue vehicle we were driving around in, and it takes me back, and I had a chance to kind of process it a little bit and sit and reflect on, I'm glad that I grew up listening to Chuck Schuldiner and Death, and that was a guy to, take something from both musically and, just what he stood for personally, and just have a moment of gratitude for that guy being not only an awesome musician, but an awesome person.
Yeah.
And I think that's the one thing that I want people to take out of this. That's why I want it to be like maybe the main first bio that we roll out, or one of the main ones that we do first, is that I want to continue to, support and push his legacy and ask people to take a moment out of your day. Dial it up, listen to it if you've never before, or if you have, dust off some of the CDs and listen to them again and share them with people that maybe have never heard any of it before.
Well, when we were, since we stacked these episodes, obviously the next episode you guys are going to hear is going to be an interview, but when we talked to Jeremy, he was talking about how he just didn't get it, and then he got it, and then he was astounded and dumbfounded and just listened to his whole catalog and listened to everything, and so it still can make an impact after all these years, and it's still something that if you haven't discovered or unfamiliar with, because we wouldn't be sitting here at all if it probably wouldn't be for that band and talking about this kind of music, because obviously there's other stuff that made an impact, but I think for both of us, I think we're on the same page when this is probably one of our top favorite bands of all time. It's always hard to say my favorite band is, because there's like 25 that come to mind, and then a new shit comes out and you get influenced by other things like we talked about before too, as well as like it's just not always death metal all the time. After you get a certain age, I'm sure there's some people out there that only listen to death metal. I mean, more power to them, but that I listen to a lot of other things and grown to other tastes, but death is always something I will come back to. I love Nick's layout of the visual aids here, so we'll get a little shot of that before his little death. I wouldn't say little, his death collection. I know I have almost all of those records, and I have a lot of the ones that are in the more like the cardboard sleeves, because I bought all of the reissues with like the demo tracks and everything. I never did get around to listening to the Control Denied. It's just something that I would like to hear all of it and not just some of it and just parts of it. You know what I mean? Because however it got out there, stuff leaks or whatever, but I just feel like I don't know if it'd be something I come back and listen to every time, because I would know what could be, right? Like, so it's like, and at the end of the day, even that demo, it's like, everybody's clamoring for a little bit more, right? But that might not even been what it was. That could have or that 30 minutes could have been scrapped altogether, and there could have been other shit on the horizon,
There was no bass on it. There's no vocal on it, It had Richard Christie's drums, so you had a pretty good idea what these songs were going to sound like. But the Control Denied album, the Fragile Art of Existence, is, it sits with the rest of the collection. It's not here right now. I don't know why. It's because this is all Death, and Control Denied starts with letter C. It was somewhere else on the rack. I didn't grab it like a bonehead. One of the things I want to impress upon people listening is that, if you're listening, you probably already like metal, or if you don't, and you're just listening because we're on it, that's cool too.
Yeah.
I want to impress people to like take the back door to listening to Chuck's music, which is listen to the interviews and maybe experience some of the other content, read the lyrics, come at it from maybe a poetic angle, and just get into the lyrical content and say, okay, this isn't like offensive or egregious or obnoxious or shocking. It's just thought-provoking, and this is not fitting of the name death, but more like, art is more or less, what I get out of it. And I would say, yeah, it's hard for the average person to listen to this, which is what I really like to see is like just people accept it a little bit more and say, it's not so bad. The fry vocal isn't the worst thing ever,
right.
like it's okay. I get it. It has its time and its place in its moment. And that's what I would like to get out of it for other people is just like giving it a chance. Or if you've never heard of it, now you have, listened to it. But yeah, give it a chance, even if it means dialing up a few interviews and getting to know Chuck and like absorbing the other content and then saying, yeah, I want to give that a chance just because this guy's so cool.
Right.
I like what he's saying. I like the way he behaves. I like what he stands for.
Yeah.
So definitely do that and let the metal flow forever.
Yeah, forever. I remember being in high school and I had the Death Symbolic shirt. And, like, of course, we got teased in high school because we like fucking metal, and like,
it is what
kids
it is.
are dickheads,
Yeah.
And I remember this kid asking me, I can't remember his name, he was some whatever, we called him preppy dude, but whatever. I just remember I had the Death Symbolic shirt, and he's like, do you kill stuff because your shirt says death? I'm like, dude, if you only knew. I'm like, I'm not going to sit here and try to explain this to you because you don't understand. You're not an introspective person by any means. You don't, you're just a fucking asshole. But at the same time, it's just like, kids are kids, and I'm sure he's grown, or whatever. But at that time, I'm just like, that's not even what this music is even about, you know what I mean? It's more about expression. It's more about, trying to accomplish your dreams, and that was the content he got into later. But it was just cool, his evolution. And just because we did a series on death, unfortunately for you listeners, doesn't mean we won't ever bring up Chuck or death again, because I'm sure it'll be a staple on this show that somehow, some way it'll be integrated into our talks and what we talk about. But you did a great job with this, Nick. I appreciate you going through this, and it gives the listener something to kind of know the story of Chuck and death and give it, I know you could have wrote on and on and on, and then it just becomes, jargon and babbling at that time, because there's so many things you could insert, or we could go through an album by album review. But I think we expressed what we needed to about Chuck and death in the right way in this series.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I put some time into it. I revisited just about everything that you see laying on the table here. I listened to all of those albums front to back a number of times, especially the second half of the catalog. I listened to those a number of times. Typing this up, I just let it roll in the background. Watched the documentary about 3 or 4 times just to make sure I was getting things accurate. Obviously, I'll have a whole list of sources to go along with this so people can check YouTube links and listen to him speak for himself. Like, I try to go to the horse's mouth as much as possible. Like, I'm not saying it because Gene said it or because Richard Christie said it. I'm saying it because Chuck said it.
Right.
And if Chuck said it, then that's going to be the law. That's going to be the Bible. That's going to be the word. If the man's going to go out and say, like, I just like to chill at home with my family and friends and eat pizza, like, then that's pretty much what I take him for. And he sounds like that kind of guy too. And that's what people said about him too. So I like that there was a consistency in that person across the board, from his art to his personal lifestyle. So I think he's definitely somebody as a historical figure that we should recognize, and we are better for it.
Okay, well, with that being said, I do want to bring up one thing that me and you were kind of joking about. If you do watch on the YouTube and you see us wearing clothes that are the same, it's not because we're sleeping here multiple days doing multiple podcasts in a row, or is it? No. It's just the fact that we stack these podcasts up. We have one day that we do podcast. We kind of keep it to that. So we may knock out 2 or 3 in a row. We do have a plan with our podcast. We kind of went over that on the first episode. And listen, we may have stumbled out the gate. I may pronounce things wrong. It is what it is. But, with anything in life, and anybody that's listening to this should take this and understand that it's all about embracing what you're not good at, and you're only gonna get better at that, especially if you're putting out content. For us, this is kind of a podcast to this degree. We may say things that might not be accurate, but just know that, treat that, knowing that, and we're willing to take corrections, and we'll correct ourselves, because we can look within ourselves like that and know everything we put out, it's not going to be perfect. It's not, and we're going to build this podcast and we're going to progress. But, Yeah, so just saying that is, I just wanted to get that off my chest because I don't want to get too preachy on this podcast and get all, Zig Ziglar on you motherfuckers. But at the same time, we are going to be ourselves on here and we are going to explain things. So, with that being said, just like Chuck, the sound of perseverance, man, you gotta persevere. You gotta start somewhere. And it's not going to be great. You're going to put out Scream Bloody Gore first. You know what I mean? That's what you're going to put out. But eventually you're going to get to your best albums and your best content, and then you're just going to refine it more and more and more. So if you do listen to this podcast and you've listened to all of our episodes, this one, any episode, just let me know that we appreciate you because we do put a lot of work into this, and it is something that we do because we love to do it, but hopefully that the listener will also enjoy as well. So,
Yeah, drop us a like in the comments. Hit us up with some corrections. Engage and share. I mean, we appreciate it. I just come here every Sunday because Jay's my boy. We love to talk about music. He's got me listening to more music, whereas maybe I wouldn't. I've listened to Death many, many times in my life, but just having the purpose to write this biography about Chuck, it gave me a reason to listen to the music all over again. And I like to have the guests over and rap with them, not only about music, but how they continue to do it. Like, we're all busy. Yeah. We all got lives like Monday through Saturday. It's like, whoo, that's a lot. There's a lot going on for almost any person. So at our age, any age really, if you're able to play music, maybe you're a teenager or maybe you're in your 20s working, going to school, whatever, it takes a lot of time to do music. And so I really want to pay attention to people who come through here, talk about the time that you put into it, and express to other people, just listeners, that we put a lot of time into it. It's not just a hobby, like, oh, we're just having fun out here. Like, it's a second job. It almost feels cumbersome at times. It makes you feel like you don't want to do it at times because it's a lot of work. And I want to impress that upon people too, is like, it's a lot of work to hold a band together, and then I think anybody that's in a band, this is a place for them to come on and tell people, this is what we're doing, this is how much work we do, and this is why we do it, So, yeah, if you're listening out there, just know that we love doing this because we love the music. We're going to talk about music no matter what. So fuck it. Let's do it on a podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
And have more people on and do that too with them.
Yep. And we do want to get your feedback. So if we have polls below in the Spotify, if you're listening on Spotify, I've set up a few polls on there. We want to know what you're listening to. Make sure you give us feedback. If you're listening on YouTube, if you're just a passive listener and you don't want to engage, that's completely fine too. But we're going to keep building this podcast, and we do appreciate every person that downloads, listens, likes our page, anything like that. Like, we really do. And we're going to continue to bring the stories of our metal heroes. We're going to continue to talk about topics that we can get other people to engage in, and we're going to continue to interview some cool ass dudes that we know, and we're going to meet some new people because I got some great ideas for this podcast, and we're excited to share the future with you guys. So thank you so much. I know I got a little sentimental at the end, but Chuck and his music will bring that out in you, and sometimes you just got to kind of explain yourself so people know where you're coming from. So with that being said, we're going to wrap this up. I'm going to say, please drop us a comment, drop us a like. If you're on Apple Podcasts, 5 stars really helps us. Tell us why you like this podcast. We are trying to do something a little different. No, it's not perfect, but we're going to strive to get better all the time, just like you should. So like, comment, subscribe, all that good shit, and much love to you guys.